Well, yes, we're switching attention to budgeting issues. Yes, talking about just how effective and efficient our budgeting system is. This comes in the light of the recent reports of the ICPC. You know what controversy it's been generating in recent times, especially with just their focus on constituency projects. We have with us this morning Mr. Ben Akabweze, who is the Director General of the Budget Office of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. And we also have with us Mr. Eze Onyekbere, who's a legal practitioner and developmental fiscal governance expert. I hope I'm getting that.
All this job breaking was coming from.
I don't know. This is what my producer wrote for me, but we have to welcome you both for coming on Sunrise Daily this morning. You have seen in recent times the controversy that has arisen as a result of a report done by the ICPC. They did this in partnership with some civil society organizations and some other government organizations, and it has called to question our budgeting process, just how effective it is and how efficient it is, what it is that we appropriate, how we appropriate it, and whether or not we eventually even get to implement it. What has been your thoughts? Do you think that it raises questions for your office?
No, it doesn't. And why do I say so? Basically, every client tends to figure out how to deal with their issues. And in our own case, years back, the concept of making provision for constituency projects in the federal government's budget was arrived at as a compromise solution between the executive and the legislature. And so essentially what my office does is make a one-line provision for the amount that has been agreed, and for the past several years that amount has been 100 billion naira. That's at the budgetary level. My office makes no input as to what projects go in. That's left entirely to the legislature, which decides how much of that 100 billion is allocated to individual legislators, and the individual legislators then nominate projects, from their constituencies.
Indeed. I'm not asking about, the headline amount allocated to zonal intervention project. I'm talking more about how the budget itself is arranged in a manner that, people would, looking at it, one would ask if this could be an efficient budget. There have been questions raised in recent times about how much is spent on recurrent expenditure, and just not just salaries, but also on things like stationery, on things like computers, on trainings and things of the sort. And even this constituency project, how it is distributed in the budget. Only recently, there were questions or there were talk around an agency of government saying that the constituency project inserted in their own budget makes them inefficient, makes them lose focus as an agency of government. Are these sort of things, or do these sort of things bother your office?
Well, I think we need to be very clear in terms of the usage of terms. What we know as constituency projects, and what's officially understood and regarded as constituency projects, is also what is called zonal intervention projects, okay, which is the projects that come within that 100 billion naira set aside. There has, unfortunately, also been the practice where, in the process of appropriation, some members of the legislature introduce projects into the budgets of the, of some MDAs, which are of a nature similar to what are called constituency projects, to the extent that they're really not issues that speak to the constitutional responsibility of the federal government, but perhaps things that should be dealt with by the local governments and, in many cases, and at best, the state governments. And so this is the one area that has been a constant source of, friction between the legislature. And so if an agency says constituency projects were, inserted, what they are basically saying is that projects that ought to be, or projects similar to what are classified as contingency projects, which do not speak to their mandate, have been, introduced into their budget during the appropriation process. And so, as I said, when that happens, the president has one of two options: either refuse to sign the budget on account of that, or sign, having regard to the overall materiality of those items and the exigencies of, having a budget passed. When if typically you're already in May or June when these disputes are happening.
Well, I don't know if I'm putting my question right. Okay, let me even remove constituency projects now and focus on the budget as presented by the MDAs themselves. Do you have any fears that it's not, when you look at it, do you think that as presented, the budget could be implemented efficiently? That's what I'm asking.
No, I understand the concerns about the high, we would love to see, a greater proportion of the budget allocated to developmental capital expenditure. And in 2016, we adopted a policy. There wasn't one before that will allocate a minimum of 30% of the budget to capital, expenditure. But we've also had, there's some practical realities that have a lot of this significant portion of the recurrent budget is, personnel costs, which have grown, substantially. The government has said it's not going to retrench, and so, and in the challenged environment, employment-wise, a number of federal agencies have been under pressure to, recruit. It doesn't justify, but again, the real big issue is personnel costs. Not all of those. In terms of overhead costs, we are underspending. The total overhead cost budget of all agencies of the federal government, and over 1,000 budget units, is under 300 billion naira. That's what you have for stationery and all of that. This, for 2020, for the first time, we've brought into the budget, the budgets of 10, parastatals. Those 10 parastatals, between them, have an overhead budget of 160 billion naira, compared to over 1,000, agencies that have, under 300 billion.
Mr. Onyekpere, you have been a very strong advocate for a more efficient budget. Can you tell us what your thoughts were when you saw this? I don't know if you've seen the ICPC report. I want to imagine that you have. Have you?
Now, the issue is beyond the ICPC report.
I agree.
No, just let me
I just wanted to know if you have seen it.
I have read about it. I haven't seen the big report, but it was reported in the media quite recently.
Yes. Were you happy that the ICPC report came out to buttress some of the things that you have been talking about?
That's why I'm saying you have to position this properly within a context. When that decision was made as to setting aside a certain amount of money every year for the legislature, it should have been followed up either with a law or a detailed policy provision on how that will be implemented. But it seems there is a void which now allows all manner of things to go on. For instance, I was looking at the 2020 budget, the executive budget currently before the National Assembly. I saw an institute of stored agricultural products in a lorry, and it had provisions for building minister there in Lagos, in Surulere. It had provisions to supply keke napep in Aniocha local government. It had provisions to supply solar energy, to give solar energy somewhere in Oshimuli, in Delta State. So you begin to ask what these things have in relationship with the mandate of an agricultural research institute on stored agricultural products. Now, when you place all these things together, you discover that what is happening is that many of the constituency projects are projects which I believe the federal government, like he pointed out, should have no business. There are legislative lists of areas of competence of the federal legislature, the state legislature, and what the local government should do. I dare say, although there are no decided cases on this, or particularly in the budget is a law. Any particular item that the National Assembly is legislating, which is outside their legislative competence, you cannot put that in the budget and it really legally stands. So you have a situation where the federal government is building town halls, all manner of things that you can pinpoint on. And some of them, if you even look at them, you cannot discover what is the deliverable. You see a program of empowering women in constituency X. What does that mean? Are you expecting the women to be trained? Are you buying them new clothes? Are they learning a new dance step? What exactly is empowerment? So there is so much loose words which cannot allow anybody who didn't craft that budget to say, if I come forward to you to say empowerment, what am I expecting in return? Nothing at all. So that's the problem. I believe that we need a law or we need policy frameworks that will clearly define what exactly and how constituency projects should be deployed. Now, coming back to this year's budget in terms of the capital expenditure, for the first time, we have a capital expenditure on paper which is lower than the money to be used for debt servicing. And is down this time around, is under 22 or 23%, while the money for debt servicing, we are discussing almost 26 by the time you add the money for sinking fund. In the previous budgets, of course, capital expenditure is usually bigger on paper. But what happens at the end of the day is that you must pay salaries. Otherwise, workers will be out there on the streets. You must service debts. You must even draw down overheads and others. Capital expenditure is the last thing that comes up when you are finished servicing others. And then whatever remains, you do capital expenditure. So that's why capital expenditure is always coming down. Practically, when you get to the end of the year, what you see actually was done never meets up with what was proposed at the beginning. So what I'm thinking about is that even there is a misconception under the Public Procurement Act. Even if you nominate a constituency project, the law does not entitle you to go there and say, I put 250 million, give it to me, or I nominate a contractor to go and implement. The money still runs through the executive. They are the ones who should pass through due process, possibly get to BPP before the contract is awarded. So if perchance you stay as a permanent secretary or head of any MDA, and because I'm a legislator, I said I nominated a project, I come to you and insist that I must nominate the contractor, or you give me the cash and you allow me to do that, the onus is on you. So we need to get these things clear so that they are not always mixed up, because the law is clear on how contracts should be awarded. The law is clear on who should manage a project. So if any legislator does go there and you agree with him, well, unfortunately, if it's a case before a court, you answer first before, because he's going to be an accomplice.
Let's quickly go to Lagos now. I understand that. Just before you, sorry, before you weighed in on that, if you can hold your thoughts, let's quickly go to Lagos now and take one more guest with my colleagues, Kayode and Ayo.
Yes, thank you, Mark. We have with us, joining us, he's in transit, but he's right now willing to speak with us. He is an anti-corruption activist and initiator of Follow the Money. Joins us from Frankfurt via Skype, Hamzat Lawal. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. So we are talking about, these budgeting issues and all of that. First of all, what is your own constraint as far as budgeting in Nigeria is concerned?
Thank you for having me. What we're experiencing now in Nigeria is a budget crisis. If you even look at the budget segment, there's a crisis that we're experiencing. And when we look at budget releases, most times we say we're meeting target in terms of recurrent expenditure. What about capital expenditure? Because that's what fuels the economy. So for me, we're experiencing a budget crisis, and we will go on and on and on. And next year, probably you have us again come and talk about this issue. If government does not ensure that we close these leakages. If we don't ensure that lawmakers actually enact law and leave the executive to execute those laws that have been enacted and ensure that they have no role to influence budget appropriation, then we're not serious and we're not going to provide the Nigerian people the dividends of democracy.
A very quick one. But just before you go on, Mr. Lawal, when you say leakages, at what point should we be looking at these leakages? At the point of budgeting, or at the point of appropriation, or at the point of disbursement of funds?
We have to look at it from a 360 perspective during appropriation, during budgeting and releases, because you have a lot of NDAs that plays a key role. But most importantly, we need to ensure that we do away with the secrecy around governance and budget itself. Because if you look at it, you don't have concrete data. Yes, sometimes the federal government will release data on releases. But then when you dig deep and you invoke the freedom of information request and say, give us specific breakdown on how this money is trickling down from the Ministry of Budget and Planning or the Ministry of Finance down to various MDAs that are meant to undertake capital expenditure. But when you even approach this MDA, particularly when you go to probably Ministry of Health or Ministry of Education, to say, what are you doing with these releases? Everybody would say, well, take us to court, because they know that they can always get away with this impunity. But basically, what's important is if we're able to do away with this secrecy, where when funds are appropriated and released, citizens are aware and informed, and then they can follow this money and hold their government accountable. And we cannot say that we've signed up on the Open Government Partnership, which President Muhammadu Buhari signed up on in 2016, and yet we don't even have access to this information in the public domain. And for some information that are available, you cannot tie this financial releases to any specific grassroots community. It's unacceptable.
Now, I'm just curious, because there's always this issue most times. How do you draw a line between wasteful spending and what is expedient? You find some items in a budget, for example, and you wonder, do we need this? And you find perhaps the agency that is responsible for that item saying, yes, we do. This is what we use it for. So the big question arises, how do we differentiate between wasteful spending and what is expedient?
For us to differentiate between the wasteful spending and what is expedient is first, we need to get our procurement process right. Because if we don't get it right, we will continue having wasteful spending. See, in Korea today, you only have one agency that handles procurement. Why is it that every ministry, department, and agency handles procurement? Why can't we have a central procurement unit that handles all federal government procurement? Because if you look at line items, in some MDAs, you want to buy a Hilux, you have a budget of 50 million. In some, you see 20. In some, you see 45 million. Why can't we have a unified process that would ensure that our procurement process is followed to the letter? And if we even look at the laws we have existing, if we follow it properly, we would be able to stop this leakage. I think that, again, National Assembly have a role to play if they want to take up the challenge. But most importantly, are we even ensuring that all these expenditures we're auditing? Today, the Audit Commission bill is sitting in the presidency. It's in front of Mr. President. Why haven't he signed this bill? We're using 60th century law to tackle 21st century issues. If we, all these expenditures, even when we have the general audit, this information is not made public. So when you spend money and nobody is overseeing your spending, then we're not auditing. We can't tackle leakages. So it's important that, one, we get this bill signed, Mr. President assent to this bill, so that we will have a commission that is independent and that is supported by policy and regulatory framework.
All right, just before we go back to Abuja, let me take, well, anyway, I want to thank you very much, Mr. Hamza Lawal, the initiator of Follow the Money, for being a part of this conversation. We're going back to Abuja now, but I'd like to ask this question of Mr. Ben Akabo, is the DG of the Budget Office, and whoever else, because I'm wondering, what role do you think the report of the Auditor General's Office will play in blocking the leakages that Mr. Lawal has made reference to? For instance, if you look at that report on page 206, it talks about the Director General of the Directorate of Employment to recover over 1.2 billion naira or account for it. And this is one of the leakages. And if you look at that reporting holistically, it's in hundreds of millions and into billions and all of that. How do we block these leakages? Who ensures that all these, this kind of report from the Auditor General's office is actually followed in order to recover these sums or cut off these wastages?
Well, I mean, the procedure is that the report of the Auditor General is presented to the Public Accounts Committee of the National Assembly. And that committee holds every agency that is indicted, in the report to account. And so they follow through whatever issues, have been, exceptions that have been highlighted in that report. But just before we went on the break, I wanted to, Ms. Onye made the point about the necessity for some policy framework or law surrounding a constituency project. There is indeed a policy framework. That policy framework, for instance, says that even though the legislators nominate the projects, the constituency projects, each project must have an executing agency. And that executing agency, once the law has been, the budget has been passed into law, funds are not released to the legislators. Funds are released to that agency. So if indeed there is, a misapplication of those funds, the executing agency, and the responsible, officers there are really the people to be held to account. And there is also within this, framework, there is a unit under the office of the Secretary General to the government of the Federation, which had a specific mandate to monitor this implementation of these constituency projects across the country and, report. The ICPC has lately then been brought in and given a role under the new framework for for this, and it's also important to clarify that even though there is 100 billion naira provision, that just like other provisions in the budget, the constituency, the project provision, the zonal intervention funds don't necessarily get funded in full. In the last few years, they've been funded at an average of about 70%.
So let me ask you quickly, are you saying that in all, and I want to make the point that this is not just about constituency projects, this is about the effectiveness of our budget so far, the efficiency, the impact that our budget has had so far, our budget and our budgeting system has had so far on the Nigerian people? Would you say that you're happy with where we are?
No, first of all, we've said it repeatedly. We're not nearly spending enough. Our budgets are too small.
But
our budgets are
whatever it is that we allocate, are we spending well?
But that's the point. You see, if you have a family of 6 people and you only have enough money to feed 2, it doesn't matter how much you manage that family isn't going to look well fed. So, of course, the efficiency of spending can be improved and always can. I mean, the gentleman was talking about, information being available in the public space. Information on releases and all of that is on a website. And we have a citizens portal on the website that encourages citizens to follow the projects, and report in whatever you find that is not going well.
Mr. Inquiry, yes, please.
Efficiency of public spending, like he did say, can be very, very much improved. I give you an example of 2 key ministries: works and housing, water resources. If you look at the number of roads and bridge projects in works and housing, and look at the pittance available to it, you will discover that if you were to multiply the money they had in this year's budget by 10, it will not even be able to do what they're supposed to do this year. So the question is, why insert 200 roads and bridges when the money available can reasonably construct between 30 and 50? So year after year, those projects keep coming back to the budget and nothing gets done. So the former DG of the BPP liken what we do in Nigeria to a man who has 10 plots of land and he had money to build duplexes in 2 or 3. Instead of going to build in 2 or 3, live in one, start collecting rent from the others, and then use it to gradually keep building. You go and build all of them and bring them up to DPC level. You neither have a house to live in, neither do you have one to rent, and the money is finished. So you don't get as much value for money as you should have gotten if we reason it out very well.
Gentlemen, I wish you could go on with this conversation, but we're totally out of time. I have to thank you for coming on Sunrise Daily this morning. Mr. Ben Akabweze is the Director General Budget Office of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Mr. Eze Onyekpere is a legal practitioner and also a development and fiscal governance expert. Sunrise Daily continues in a moment. Please stay with us.